Hello again and welcome back to our course on Access 2013 Advanced. In the last couple of sections we've been looking at macros in Access, and in the last one we looked in particular at autoexec macros, a very important aspect of Access 2013, and in fact autoexec has been a very important feature of Access pretty much since the beginning. Now I'm going to look at one other example here of an autoexec, and this one you may find is a little bit disappointing, but it's got one or two very important features in it that we need to look at because we're going to be referring to these later on. So the idea behind this is that we have a login dialog, which seems like a really good idea. You can restrict access to the front end of your database by requiring users to have a valid login, possibly with a password as well. Now, one important feature of something like this dialog is for a login dialog, particularly if you're going to use it as a modal dialog to stop people using the database without a valid login, you wouldn't leave a close button in the top right because you can just bypass it by clicking on that. So let's set that to one side for the moment. It's also quite unusual when you have a login dialog that is protecting a system from people that aren't supposed to be using it. It's quite unusual to have a drop down giving you a choice of employees. You'd normally have to enter your username and password, but again we'll set that to one side. Let's assume that that's working properly. We'll click on the login, and that allows us into the database and opens the Northwind Traders home form. But let's have a look at that autoexec macro. Now the very first action says set display categories, show yes, category Northwind Traders. Using macros you can control with a fine level of detail what's shown on the navigation pane. If you're familiar with using the navigation pane, there's a whole set of options. Let me click on the drop down here that lets you navigate to a particular category, the object type category, tables and related views and so on. And you can either show or hide those categories in the same way that you can show and hide many other aspects of what the user can see on the navigation pane. Now I'm not going to go into that in detail here, it would take a very long time, but you can control that very much in the way that this is shown here. Set display categories, show yes, Northwind Traders. You can have several such commands to show and hide various elements on the navigation pane. I am going to talk about the navigation pane in a little while. I'll come back to that. What I really want to concentrate on is this first if statement here, so let me just collapse that down. If not current project is trusted, then show the startup screen. And then following on from that there's a second if statement. If the current project is trusted, then open the form the login dialog. Now that means that if a user gets hold of this database and it's not trusted, it's not in a trusted location, or they've not declared it to be a trusted document, they're going to get a warning to that effect. Now the Northwind Traders sample database I put in a trusted location earlier on, so what I'm going to do now is to close this down and I'm going to move the database to a different location, and you can just see what happens. So here we are, let's open Northwind Traders, and what I see now is this startup screen. Northwind Traders, welcome to the Northwind Traders sample database. Now if you look in the navigation pane under forms, you'll see that if we scroll down we can find this startup screen. There it is. Let me just go into design view for that, and of course that is part of the database. So one option for you when you're designing your database is to make the equivalent of this. So you can use a startup screen that says to people, this is not a trusted database, you've not declared it to be a trusted document, you've not put it in a trusted location, so you need to trust it and then you'll be okay. Now the instruction that they've given you here, welcome to the Northwind Traders sample database. In order to use this sample, click options on the message button, select enable content, click on that, it becomes a trusted document, and then in the balance of the autoexec it opens the login dialog, because from that point it is now a trusted database and therefore Access is quite happy to open it for you. You can obviously click on login and continue. So let's now take a look at this login dialog and see what needs to be done to that to make it work. At the moment it's only partly functional. It does actually present you with a dialog, a modal form. You can actually close the form without logging in. Ideally there will be some element of authorization involved, but actually what it does is to just present you with a single name. It doesn't ask you for a password or anything. You can find which name it presents you with. If you select the control here with the drop down next to it, and let's just go to properties, bring up the property sheet for that control, we can see that although the control source is unbound, there is a row source that basically selects from the employee's extended query, and then their default value, if I can just click in that and I'll go into the expression builder, the default value is a value from the employee privileges table, and again this uses the dFirst function, but again you can trace this through and work out exactly what it's doing. If I open up the employee privileges table, I can see there's one person within it, Andrew Cencini, and he's the only person that ever appears as a candidate to log in under. Now if you're not Andrew Cencini, in theory you can't log in. In practice you just click the login button anyway. Having a login dialog with a username and password is generally a really good way of, at least in part, protecting your database, and you've seen some of the elements of implementing that here, but obviously you'd need to do quite a bit more to this to make it work properly. Now I'm going to make a change to that autoexec macro because we're going to move on to a very important subject in relation to macros and autoexec and security. I'm going to go into design view on that autoexec macro. I'm going to delete the first command, the set displayed categories action, which is not really doing anything useful for us at the moment. And what I'm going to do instead is to add very special macro command. Now if I select the macro commands category amongst the actions, the one I want is run menu command. Now if you double click one of these and it appears within your action list, if it's in the wrong place, which this one is, you can easily move them around using these arrows. So if I want to move this one up right up to the beginning of the macro, just chase it till it's at the top, and the command I want in that one is window hide. So that's my new macro. I'm going to close that, save those changes. I'm going to close Northwind Traders and I'm going to open it again and we'll see what happens. Now once again I've got my login, but note there is no navigation pane. The navigation pane is hidden. I click on login, I see the home page there but no navigation pane, and that appears to be really good news from a security point of view, because very often when you've got users using an Access database that you've designed and developed, you don't want them having access to the navigation pane. However, we do know that they can press the F11 key and bring it back again. We'll talk about suppressing that in a moment, and there's also another way that we can get around that, and we're going to talk about that in a moment as well. Now let's start by looking at that F11 key, the business of being able to press the F11 key to show the navigation pane. If you go into the Access options and click on the current database page, there is an option, use Access special keys, in the center there. That being checked means that users have the option of using the F11 key to show the navigation pane. If before you distribute this to your users you uncheck that option, then the F11 key will not show the navigation pane for your users. So that's a fairly straightforward way of disabling the F11 key. However, I mentioned there's another problem, and the other problem is really a bit more of a problem. Let me once again close this database down, and I'm going to open it again, but this time as I click on open I'm going to hold the shift key down. If I hold the shift key down and then select Northwind Traders, what happens is it completely bypasses the autoexec. In fact, it bypasses startup options as well. So you basically get, if you like, raw access to that database. Now, disabling that is much more of a challenge. Not everybody knows about this. Many of your users won't know that if they hold the shift key down while they open the database, then they get access to a lot of things that you probably didn't intend them to have access to. But unfortunately, once somebody finds out about this sort of thing, then the word gets round, and people, if they want to make a change to a form, or they're waiting for you to change a report and they think they'll just tweak it themselves, they find out that if they hold the shift key down, they can go in and bypass whatever your startup options are, and whatever's in your autoexec macro becomes a bit of a habit. Now, it is possible to stop people bypassing that, but you have to do it using VBA code. I am not going to go through that option now because it's actually quite a dangerous thing to do, and I sort of officially shouldn't be encouraging you to do it. Having said that, most people that administer Access databases do this, or they do in a situation where it's important that what's in the autoexec, etc., does get run. And the instructions for doing it, although it does involve VBA code, are actually not particularly complicated, difficult instructions to follow. You can find them easily on the web by looking at the database property. This is all one word, allow bypass key. And if you search for that, if you Google that, you'll find the instructions for disabling the ability to bypass the autoexec. So now there's an exercise for you to do. I want you to take the latest copy of the movies database, which will be example 6 in the exercise file folder, and I want you to put together an autoexec macro for that database, and each user will be able to specify in a local settings table whether they want to see the welcome form or not. Now, I've done you a draft welcome form with a simple JPEG image on it. The image is called clapperboard.jpg. I've also included that in the exercise folder as well, so if you'd like to replace it with something else, or perhaps a different version of that form to your own requirements, your own style, you will of course need to set up a local table for settings, and you will need to link the form to a record in that table as we saw earlier on. So that's pretty straightforward based on what you've seen already. And also in that autoexec, I'd also like you to hide the navigation pane. Don't worry about overriding people's ability to re-show it and so on. Just hide the navigation pane. Now, while we're talking about hiding the navigation pane, don't forget there is another way of doing that. You don't have to do it in autoexec. I want you to do it in that particular exercise. But if you go into File, Options, and go to the current database options, one of the options down there under navigation is display navigation pane, and if you uncheck that, bear in mind these are startup options, so this runs before the autoexec, then just by having that unchecked you're going to hide the navigation pane anyway. Also note this button immediately below display navigation pane, navigation options. That gives you access to the navigation options dialog, and the functionality of this basically overlaps the macro option we were looking at earlier in terms of switching on and off the visibility of categories on the navigation pane, and you can basically customize the navigation pane to a very high degree using this dialog. It's outside the scope of what we're doing on this course, but if you want to be able to control what you or your users see in the navigation pane, this is one way of doing it, and using those macro commands is another way of doing it. So my answer to this exercise is example 7 in the supplied files. Got one more thing to look at in relation to macros at the moment, and that's macro security, that I'm going to cover briefly in the next short section, so please join me for that.